So the relationship between God and evil is a challenging one, right? Meaning how the reality of evil fits with the existence of a good God. That's a really challenging topic. And I think that's a topic that we all have wrestled with to certain extents, right? I mean, we've probably all at some point in our lives wrestled with these kind of like questions. Maybe we've gone through some sort of trials, maybe we've gone through some sort of suffering, and it's very natural when we're going through trials to kind of like wonder, like, God, where are you? God, what are you doing? God, why are you allowing this? God, are you even really there? But it doesn't, like, we don't even need to be going through trials. You can just look out in the world and see the world's pretty messed up. There's a lot of brokenness out there. There's a lot of hurt out there. And so it's natural just to ask these kind of questions. Like, God, what is going on? And we know that the skeptic, people who are skeptical of Christianity, maybe an atheist or someone who doesn't even believe in God, they certainly seize on this topic. If you ask someone who's an atheist, like, why don't you believe in God? The number one cited reason is because, of course I don't believe in God. Look at all the evil and suffering out there in the world. And so these are going to be the types of questions that we're going to be addressing tonight. And my approach, I'm going to try to address these questions like really methodically, really systematically. And that's because there's just so many different aspects to these types of questions. There's so many kind of different routes you can go with it. Sometimes it's difficult even knowing where to start. And so I'm going to take a three-step approach where I'm really kind of building a case and really trying to respond to this challenge to God's existence or our belief in God that comes from evil. Step one of our case has to do with understanding the skeptic's task. Understanding the skeptic's task. And as we kind of move through this first step, what we're really thinking through is a specific question. And the question we're trying to kind of wrestle through is, what would justify unbelief in God? So what would it take? What would it take to kind of say, yeah, God probably doesn't exist? Or yeah, we're probably it's more rational to doubt belief in God. And to get here, I want to start with a distinction that I don't think is often made, but I think it's an important distinction. And it's this. It's that there's a difference between the question, why does God allow evil, whatever form that question may take, and the problem of evil. There's a difference between the question, why does God allow evil, and the problem of evil. So when I refer to the problem of evil, what I'm referring to is just basically this idea that evil is in some way problematic for God's existence. So the problem of evil is really an argument. It's an argument trying to show that God doesn't exist based on the evil and suffering that's out there in the world. And why I'm making this distinction, and I think this distinction, what I'm kind of referring to, will be kind of progressively become clearer. But why I'm trying to make this, or there's kind of two things that I'm trying to show. First, you don't actually necessarily need to answer this question, why does God allow evil, to show that this argument fails. You don't necessarily even need to start addressing why does God allow evil to show that the problem of evil fails. We'll get to that. But the second thing that I'm trying to show, and this is what we're going to focus on right now, is the skeptic. And by the way, I'm going to be referring to the skeptic a lot. And I just mean people who are skeptical of this Christian claim or just the claim in general that God exists. People who are skeptical of God's existence and they're using evil to try to show that we should doubt God's existence. And by the way, like for the most part, we think of the skeptic and how I'm going to be talking about it, you're thinking of like someone else, like an outside skeptic, and that's fine. But I also want, when I say the skeptic, just think for yourself. Think for yourself, just kind of like wrestling through these questions and just your natural doubts that arise. So the second thing I'm trying to show by making this distinction is that skeptic has a task to do, an argument to make in order to justify their skepticism. The confusion is this. It's often assumed by the skeptic, by us even as Christians, that if a skeptic can ask really difficult questions of Christianity, maybe questions that he or she never gets a sufficient answer to, that the skeptic has justified their skepticism. For example, when it comes to evil, the skeptic feels like I can ask you Christians, why does God allow, if God's so good, why is there so much evil out there in the world? And then if they don't get a sufficient response back, no one could answer my question, the skeptic feels like they've justified their skepticism about God. And you hear kind of like these types of, this way of thinking all the time. So someone may say this, maybe we've heard people say this, maybe we've said this. Until someone can answer this question, I'll never believe. Until someone can actually address this, I'll never believe. But what I'm trying to get at here is that's actually not sufficient. Meaning to justify your skepticism towards God, you have to do more than ask challenging questions. You actually have to show that these concepts are problematic. So for example, when it comes to evil, it's not enough just to say, well, if God's so good, why is there so much evil? And then, oh, there's no answers. You have to do more than ask a question. You actually have to show how the existence of evil poses some sort of problem or incompatibility with God's existence. There's a task for the skeptic to do, and this task involves more than just asking hard questions, even unanswered questions. That alone isn't enough. And the reason why it's not enough is because questions are not arguments. And that's kind of like almost like an elementary principle of critical thinking. So the question I want to ask right now is, when it comes to evil, does evil really pose a problem for God? Does evil really pose a problem for God's existence? And what we assume is like, of course it does. Of course there's a problem there. Of course there's something that we need to solve here. And so right now, for this just first step, right, we're building. But I just want us to kind of adjust our mindset, our approach a little bit when we face challenges like this. And what I want us to realize is we often fill in a lot of blanks subconsciously. And so we hear some sort of question like that, and we're like, okay, there's a problem. There's something I need to solve. But the problem for like here, for instance, with evil and God's existence, it actually isn't as obvious as we sometimes think. And so the mindset shift is, I want us to get out of just assuming problems when we hear tough questions, where problems aren't actually explicit. So let's make this really concrete. What is the argument at this point, right? We're building just at this point. If you just face the challenge, hey, there's no way we can believe in God's existence. Just look at how messed up this world is. What is the actual argument at this point? Fleshed out, the argument is this. I'm kind of going to flesh it out just to make it explicit. Evil exists, right? And that's something that we all, I'm not going to challenge that premise, right? We all accept that. Therefore, God doesn't exist, or therefore you're not justified to believe in God. If all, like, right, first step, if all we're going on is, yeah, there's no way you can believe in God given the evil that we see in this world, that's what the argument amounts to. Evil exists, therefore God doesn't exist, or something along those lines. And what I want you to see is that this argument, just as such, this is in no way a valid argument. How do you get from here to here? How are these ideas even connected? I know you're filling in gaps. Don't do that. This isn't valid. This statement doesn't lead to this. There's something missing. Like, we need something in here to bridge that gap. There's a lot more that's needed here, at least at this point, to be kind of like filled in to make this a coherent argument. And what I want to say right now, and this is kind of the main point that I'm getting at least at this point, filling this in, bridging this gap, that's the skeptic's role. That's their job to do, right? They're the ones who think that there's some sort of problem or incompatibility between these points. I don't. As a theist, I don't think there's any problem with evil existing and God existing. I think they're both realities, right? It's the skeptic who thinks there's a problem. Therefore, it's the skeptic's role to bridge that gap, to formulate some sort of argument, to show that these things are actually a problem. So for me, before I can respond to a question or something that kind of assumes this, I need something to respond to, right? I need to know what the problem is. What is the problem here? That's the skeptic's role. That's their task to show. And one reason I'm kind of harping on this point is because I think this doesn't just apply to this question. This is like widely applicable. So just for example, and this is going to help you kind of see the point that I'm getting at. I came across this YouTube video a couple months ago. And The title is, if you can't see it, Why I Gave Up Christianity and the Questions No Pastor or Preacher Could Answer. And that's kind of like a clickbait title. But I don't know, when I come across something like that, I'm like, oh, I got to. I'm like a sucker for that. And it's like, okay, what are these questions? And I bet they can be answered. But but basically, and he fleshes this out more, the questions that he never got a sufficient answer to are effectively, why did God create the devil? And his point was, if God is all-knowing, if God is all-powerful, he would be able to achieve his purposes without creating a devil and, all the confusion and misled people that comes from that. And his second question was, why did God create hell? And it's kind of like along the same lines. If God is all-powerful, he could have achieved whatever purpose he wanted without creating hell and, billions of people who are lost. Challenging questions, for sure. But what I want to say is our typical approach when we hear challenges like that could be hearing it internally, like our own struggles. I think we hear questions like that and we panic. Oh man, I have to answer this. What's the answer? And so we start kind of searching our minds. Okay, how do I answer to that? How do I answer those questions? And we're kind of stressed out about it, right? It creates a certain tension. And so we panic. We really, there's a problem there. I need to answer it. And what ends up happening is we often latch on to really bad answers. Just in this stress of okay, I have to deal with this somehow. And that's exactly what happened in his case. So the kind of responses that he got, and I think that these are bad responses, are we'll never know the answer to certain questions like that, and so you just need to have faith in God. Or who are you to question God's ways? Or things like this. And so he didn't feel that those are sufficient answers. I don't feel that those are sufficient answers. And so he's like, boom, I gave up Christianity. I'm done. What I want to do is say, when we struggle with kind of challenges like this and these types of questions, before we panic, before we're like, oh, I need to answer, there's some sort of problem, let's solve it. What I want us to do, I want us to almost kind of build a new first step. And that's stop, take a breath, and almost take a step back. Because the problem when we try to solve problems like this right away is often we're solving problems that don't really exist. When I first see this title, I don't actually know how these two ideas connect to each other. Questions no Christian could answer me. That's why I gave up Christianity. My thought is, so what if no one could answer your questions? Could you show in any way that these ideas, these concepts are problematic for Christianity? Because unless you can actually show that there's a problem here, you've in no way justified your unbelief. Think about it this way. We could come up with 1 million questions, a little bit of exaggeration, about any subject matter that would be difficult for someone to respond to. Do you not think that we could come up with 12 questions right now about atheism, which he believes in, he holds to, that he wouldn't be able to answer? Of course. We're just ignorant as human beings, right? And so my question is why is it that, Christianity, I couldn't answer these questions, I walk away. But it's bro, I guarantee you whatever belief system you hold to, there's dozens of questions that you can't answer. And so it can't just be about that. It can't just be about unanswered questions. There's something more, and the something more is just critical thinking, and it's this idea that it's not enough just to ask questions that can't be answered. It's really about, do certain ideas lead to other ideas? That's what we're trying to show. And all I'm asking us at this point is, when we think that certain ideas lead to other ideas, let's just stop making assumptions. Let's really flesh out what the specific problems are, and then you'll actually have something to respond to. Does that make sense? Here's the reason why I think this point is so important and why I started with it. It is so easy to play the skeptic about anything. If I were skeptical of Christianity right now, it'd be so easy for me to stand up here. You think God exists? Tell me why there's so much evil and suffering in this room, in this world, in this room, not in this world. And what I would do at this point is I just sit back. No matter what answer you gave me, I just pick it apart, right? And no matter how compelling of an answer you gave me, it would never be sufficient. And we've had conversations like this, right? And I'm not just picking on the skeptic, and it's not always like that. I'm not saying people don't have genuine questions, so don't take it that way, but that's often how it is. And it's not just the skeptic, it's us too. If we really don't want to believe something, sometimes no matter what evidence flies in our face, it just doesn't matter. And so because of that, when I'm approached with, say, challenging questions like this, or why God allows evil, no matter how confident I am in my ability to answer something like that, before I ever respond, I want to set that response in its proper context. Meaning I always try to show people that, yeah, I would love to answer your question, but in some way I want them to see that even if I can't answer that question, or even if they don't think that my answer is sufficient, they've in no way justified their unbelief. To justify their unbelief or whatever belief that they hold to, they actually have to show that these concepts are problematic for what I believe. Does that make sense? What I'm not saying is that we shouldn't have answers to questions like this. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it's vital to put those answers in their proper context. And when we don't do this, we often leave ourselves in just a very considerable hole. So step one is just this idea that the skeptic has a task to do that goes beyond just question asking. Step two, we're going to build on that. This task for the skeptic, I'm talking about specifically when it comes to evil, showing that evil is problematic for God's existence, is doomed to failure. So, of course, if we go back here, of course, this isn't a valid argument. That's not formulated in any sense, but people have attempted to really legitimately flesh out a problem of evil type argument. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that no matter how the problem of evil argument is formulated, it's going to fail. So the question, and what we're really trying to think through here, is this question. Is the existence of evil a good reason not to believe in God? And I'll spoil it. The answer to that question is going to be no. And the reason is because no matter how you actually end up fleshing out a problem of evil type argument, it's always going to suffer from the same fatal flaw. And that fatal flaw has to do with our knowledge. More specifically, it has to do with the limitations of our knowledge and foresight. Let me tell you a story to help illustrate what I'm trying to get at. And this story is on the origins of COVID, how COVID-19 first came into our world. And I need to start with this. This is completely made up by me. So this story is completely fictional. If it is in no way meant to be historically accurate, scientifically accurate, it's certainly in no way meant to be a political statement at all. So if you're hearing me tell this story and you're well, science experiments or viruses don't work like that, you're just missing the point. So just listen to my story, and then I'm going to try to make sense of why I'm even telling you this story at the end. One morning, in the fall sometime of 2019, a man wakes up. He wakes up in his bedroom. He kind of wakes up a little startled. And the reason why he's a little startled is because it's light out. He reaches across his nightstand, presses on his phone. His phone won't light up. It had died. He kind of looks across the room. There's a clock. He sees that it's a little after 7. The reason why he's startled is because he was supposed to wake up at 6. And obviously his alarm didn't go off because his phone died. What he doesn't actually even know at this point is his phone died just a few minutes before 6. So a few minutes before the alarm was supposed to go off. And the night before, he had made a phone call that he was kind of wrestling with. Do I need to make this phone call tonight? Can I leave it to another time? But he made that phone call. And so had he not made that phone call, there would have been enough power left in the battery, get him through the night, at least wake him up at 6 o'clock, he'd be good to go. The reason why he's kind of panicking is because this is a scientist in China. And he's working in this laboratory where they study kind of infectious diseases and viruses and all these kind of things. And today, this morning actually, there's a really important deadline for him to meet. So he has to be there on time. This is really serious stuff. He's working specifically on this novel COVID virus, and there's a deadline that he has to meet. But he's not too panicked. He still has time. His office is about 20 minutes away. So he wakes up quickly, showers quickly, gets dressed quickly, feels like he still has time for a quick meal, pours a bowl of cereal. A few minutes, he's out the door, driving to work. About 10 minutes later, he's stopped at a red light. As he stopped at this red light, 2 cars come through the intersection. Boom. They crash right in front of him. And he's actually so close to the accident that there's just no way for him to get around. And so he just has to wait 10, 15 minutes, for law enforcement, all the emergency services and all that to at least clear a lane so he can go around. Finally, after about 15 minutes, he's able to go around. He gets to work, panicked, a little bit rushed, kind of just jumps straight into his work. He goes into his laboratory or wherever scientists go, and he's about to enter the room where he's actually working with this virus. And so obviously you need to wear protective suits and all that kind of stuff. So he puts on his protective material, all that, jumps into his work. There's one step that he missed. Typically after he puts on his protective material and all that, he double checks all of it just to make sure it's all good to go. He didn't do that. He was too rushed. He's panicked. He has a deadline to meet. What he didn't realize is that in one of his gloves, there was just a little cut, a little hole in one of the fingers. And so while he's working with the virus, it somehow gets on his finger. That should be okay because, there's decontamination protocol and all that stuff, but he's just in so rush. I don't know exactly how it happened. He didn't tell me. But as he's leaving, at some point before he sterilizes properly, he touches his face. And either through his nose or his eyes, he gets this virus. Eventually, he spreads it to his family, he spreads it to his coworkers, and you all know the rest is history, right? World-changing event. All of our lives are affected by that. Why did I tell you this very fictional story? We naturally think of an event like COVID, and however it happened, right? However it was spread around, how mishandled or whatever. And we think of that as a massive event, right? And we rightfully think of that way. It is a massive event. It changed all of our lives. What we often neglect and don't think about is all of the small, seemingly insignificant events that were necessary for that big event to occur. What we don't think about is all these small, almost seemingly meaningless events that led up to that big event. So for example, with the scientist, what if he had just not made that phone call the night before? Right? When he's making the phone call, there's no way that he could have known what this is ultimately going to lead to. If I make this phone call, my phone's going to die. I'm going to be rushed. I'm going to rush through my safety protocol and destroy the world. Right? There's no way he could have known in that moment how big of a deal this phone call to make it or not would be. What about him just choosing to get a bowl of cereal? There's no way you sit down for a bowl of cereal and I wonder if this is going to change the world. Maybe you do. But had he not eaten that bowl of cereal, he would have left the house a few minutes earlier, meaning he would have been through that intersection a few minutes earlier. He wouldn't have had to sit behind that traffic accident. He would have made it to work on time, wouldn't have been panicked, would have gone through his normal double-check procedure, and everything would be good. Or think of those 2 lives. What about the 2 people who were in the accident? Think of all the seemingly insignificant small events that led up to them being in the intersection at the perfect time to stop this guy and so that COVID happened, right? There's no way those people are thinking man, should I go to the store right now? Should I wait 5 minutes or whatever? I could get in an accident and it could lead to a virus infecting this world. Right? Of course not. You could never predict that. And the point that I'm trying to make is with any of those small, seemingly insignificant events, no one in their right mind, no one has even the capabilities of predicting where these small, insignificant, seemingly events would ever lead to. The ripple effect that they might have through history. And that's because as humans, we have a very limited perspective. I'm limited by my location, right? I don't know what's going on in the world. I'm right here. I'm limited by just my time, this one moment that I'm in the present. I don't see the future. I barely know what happened in the past, right? So we're just very limited in our perspective. And so you just have no idea what the ripple effects of any event, even if they seem insignificant in your life or just out there in the world, what that might ultimately lead to. And now you might be thinking, you're using all these examples that are just made up, a phone call, cereal, those didn't really happen. But that actually doesn't matter. Do you not think that however COVID was first, brought into this world, that there were dozens, if we don't span the scope, thousands of small, seemingly insignificant events that led up to it? That in the moment, no one could predict what this would ultimately lead to? Of course. You don't know the effects of coming to class tonight will be. Maybe if you had options, you had a choice, you could have stayed home, you could have gone somewhere else. Maybe had you stayed home, something significant would have happened, for good or bad. Am I saying that's the case? No. Am I saying that's even likely? No. What I'm just saying is it's possible, and there's no way for us to know given how limited our perspective is. We don't know the ripple effects of any event, anything that happens, and kind of like the net effects it'll have throughout history, where something ultimately leads. What does that have to do with the problem of evil? In the exact same way, we don't know or have any ideas the ripple effects throughout history of any specific instance of evil and suffering. You have no idea of that instance of evil and suffering, where that may ultimately lead. Something that looks to you like it's utterly pointless, something that looks to you like there's no good that could possibly come from it, you can't make that judgment. Something good may come from it, may end up in a net positive. The good that may come from that event that seems insignificant or it seems like pointless to you may not emerge for centuries later. It might emerge somewhere in the other side of the world. You don't know this. Am I saying at this point that that's the case? No, I'm just saying you can't know. We can't make these types of judgments. The problem here is that we have to make these types of judgments in order to make these types of claims that we're making when it comes to the problem of evil. So let's go back to our argument. What I'm trying to say is that in order to make this argument one way or another, we're going to have to make those types of judgments that we can't possibly make, meaning no matter how we bridge this gap. So maybe we say evil exists, a good God would want to stop all evil, therefore no God exists. Or evil exists, a good God would prefer a world with no evil and suffering, therefore no God exists. It doesn't really matter. I'm not too worried about this being valid or not. It's just however we flesh this out, we're making assumptions and we're making judgments that we couldn't possibly make. We couldn't know that. A good God would want to stop all instances of evil and suffering. You could not possibly know that without seeing the full picture. We're not in a position to make those claims. We don't know how those events turn out. We don't even know what possible justification God could have possibly for allowing these things. We're not in a position to make those kind of judgments one way or another. The problem is we need to be able to make those judgments to carry or defend a problem of evil type argument. The whole argument rests on those types of judgments. God wouldn't allow this. God's not justified for allowing this. God would want to stop this. You don't know. And because of that, the problem of evil is a failed argument. Listen closely. The problem of evil argument is very emotionally powerful. Right? It tugs on our heartstrings because we all rightfully care about the evil and suffering that we see in this world. Very emotionally powerful. I'm not denying that. It's not a rational argument. And this is actually why many philosophers, I'm talking about skeptical philosophers, have abandoned this argument altogether. There's no genuine connection between evil's existence and God's existence. At least in this sense, there's no problem to be found. Or at least no problem that we could actually defend. Step number 3, there are actually really good reasons to think that God would allow evil and suffering. So with this last step, what I kind of want to get into is I want to start to answer that question, why does God allow evil? Of course, the answer is going to be completely insufficient because there's so much to this. We just don't have time. But so in the previous step, I think we did something very important. I think we really undercut what is the main argument, sometimes the only argument offered against God's existence. And that's a really important task, right? But at the same time, that's not really emotionally satisfying. Because, okay, we undercut, there's no good argument there, or seemingly, But we still have this question, like, well, why does God allow evil? Right? That question is still there even if the argument fails. And it's still a very interesting and important question. And so that's why we're going to kind of start to address that question. But the first two steps that led up to this are still very important, because what those first steps do is as we kind of ask this question and try to answer this question, it puts our answer in the proper context. Meaning we're not trying to answer this problem, well, why does God allow evil, in like desperation, because we think that if we can't answer it, people's unbelief will be justified. Or we think that we have to answer it in order to justify our belief in God. No. We're asking it and answering it because it's a meaningful, very important question. But nothing about God's existence rides on our answer to this. And that's very important to see. I think the biggest reason why we can't understand in general why God allows evil and suffering in this world is because we don't have a real grasp on free will. And free will is a really difficult concept. But we don't really grasp the effects, the implications of free will. We don't really have a good grasp on what it takes to shape someone who has freedom, who has choice. We don't really grasp the cost of intervening in the life of someone with free will. And with all these questions, I think the people that will actually understand what I'm getting at most are parents. And you don't actually have to be a parent. Just think of a child who you care about. As a parent, you want to shape your child in a certain way, right? Meaning you want your child to grow up and develop to be intelligent. You want them to grow up and develop to be kind and loving and moral people. You want them to grow up and shape them to be resilient and all independent, all these things, right? Is that an easy task to accomplish that? No, of course not. It's not an easy task at all. Why isn't it an easy task? It isn't an easy task because your child is a human being who has freedom, free will. They make their own choices. If they were just a robot, you could program all these things into them. But we can't. And so it makes this a very difficult task, because there's the reality that no matter even how well you raise that child, there's always the possibility that they still turn out poorly. And that's because they have choice. They choose how to respond to circumstances. They choose how to respond to the environment that you give them. Right? There's no guarantee that develop will happen. It's a very difficult task because of their freedom, but not only that, because you have free will too, right? And you mess up as parents. Not all of you. No, I'm just kidding. But not only that, as a parent, you realize that there's a cost to intervening in your child's life too, right? Let me ask you this question. Do you enjoy seeing your child hurt or suffering? If you're a decent human being, the answer is no. No one does. But my question will be, well, why do you allow it? Your child goes to the park. They run around, scrape their knee, start crying. You don't like seeing that, do you? Why did you allow that to happen? And you might be thinking, well, how would I have stopped it? Could I just catch them every time they're about to fall? It's like, no, you could have stopped that. You could have not taken them to the park. You could have locked them in a padded room. You could take them to the park and just put pads or bubble wrap around them, right? And you kind of laugh a little bit because you know those are stupid suggestions. But my question is why? They would protect them. But the reason why those are dumb suggestions is because, yeah, that would protect them from getting cut, but there's other costs to that, right? You sometimes have higher aims that would interfere with. If you lock them in a room, they wouldn't have a cut knee, but they might develop mental problems, right? If you put them in bubble wrap every time that they could potentially get hurt, yeah, they're never going to scrape their knee, but they're also never going to grow resilient or tough, right? And so there's cost to intervening too. And just the mere fact with free creatures, you can't necessarily have it all, right? You have certain aims, you have certain goals for your child, and sometimes those things come in conflict. The same exact thing applies just on a different level with God and us. God has certain aims for us as human beings, as free creatures. And those aims sometimes come into contradiction. Sometimes you can't have it all. And when I say this, people have a problem with this, because when I say you can't have it all, we can't necessarily develop in the exact way that God wants us, but him also always protect us and keep us safe. They think that I'm in some way limiting God's omnipotence. And that's actually the YouTube video that I referred to. That was kind of like his problem and misunderstanding. If God's all powerful, couldn't he? I'm in no way limiting God being all powerful. What I'm saying is that's just part of the implications of free will. As soon as you create free creatures, there's choice involved. And no matter how perfect our circumstances, some of us will reject God. Some of us will fail. We won't always develop right because we don't always respond right to those circumstances. Those are our choices. And so the like main question at this point that I think that we need to be asking is, well, what are God's aims for human beings? What are his aims for free creatures? And what I want you to see is that we naturally make an assumption when we kind of push these kind of challenges that the problem of evil pushes, when we think, God, how could you allow this? God, you couldn't have stopped that? God, you couldn't have kept that from happening? What I want you to see is not explicit, it's implicit, but there's kind of an assumption being made. And the assumption being made is this: God, if God were really good, or what God should aim in our life is to give us a safe, comfortable environment. That should be God's top aim. Hey, God, you couldn't have done that. You couldn't have stopped that. You couldn't have ended those consequences. You couldn't have made sure that didn't. What we want from God and what we think that God should have as his highest aim is to give us a safe, comfortable environment. That's kind of the assumption behind these types of questions when they're asked in this way. But what I want to ask is, well, what if God has higher aims? And they sometimes come into conflict with that aim. So what if God, he does want to give us a safe, comfortable environment, but he has higher goals for us than that? What could those goals be? Well, it could be maybe the development of our character, right? The same thing that we want for our children. God wants that for us. He wants us to develop in a certain way. He wants us to be moral people. He wants us to be intelligent, resilient people. And the problem is, and the thing that I don't think we always realize, is where our logic leads. When we're like, God, you couldn't have intervened here. God, you couldn't have done something about this. God, you couldn't kept this from happening. If you really flesh out the art, like the logic and what we're really asking for, ultimately, it takes some steps to get here, but ultimately what we're wanting, what we're desiring, is we're saying, God, you couldn't create this a world where none of my actions and none of anyone else's actions have any consequences. You couldn't just protect us so that the things that we do don't have any consequences. You couldn't stop that. And the problem here, and the problem that I hope we all realize, is that a world where our actions and our behaviors and the things that we do and the things that we choose don't have any consequences is in a world where you can't develop as people. There's no way to develop your character if nothing that you do matters. If there's no difference between if you save someone or you point a gun and shoot it. If God's going to make this outcome the same anyway, how do you develop character? And beyond that, I think we also realize it doesn't always work this way. But sometimes our character development happens most through times of trials and suffering. Right? Sometimes it's specifically in those instances, and you hear people say things like this. It almost sounds like a crazy statement at first, but we've all maybe said this. We've all heard people say this. Hey, I went through one of the worst experiences of my life. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. But if I had to do it again, I would. I wouldn't change that experience for anything. We've heard people say that, right? And you're like, whoa, that's crazy, right? Why, if it was so horrible, why did you go through it? And the reason why most people would go through it again is because they developed in some way from it, right? It made them a better person. Character lasts, our circumstances don't. Well, what else could possibly be a higher aim of God? Well, the Christian worldview teaches that God's highest aim for us, his free creatures, is knowledge of him. God ultimately wants us to know him. And remember, when I say know him, that's more than just like, I know that God exists. It's like, I believe in God. I trust in him. I follow after him. That's God's highest aim. Why is that God's highest aim? Because that's the ultimate good. There's no greater good than knowing God and being in relationship with him. In fact, it's such a high good that it trumps any negative experience that we could possibly face on this earth. Would a comfortable, safe environment be the best environment for this? to bring free creatures into knowledge of him? Once again, the answer is no. It's not always the case, but it's often through our trials, through our difficulties that we come to know God, let alone that we come to know him better and become more dependent on him. Is it not? Often, not always. It's often those times when everything is going right that we don't think that we have any need for God. It's often when we're comfortable and safe that we don't think that we need God. And so kind of like the meaning of all of this, I'm going to kind of put it together. Not only is the presence of evil and suffering not in any way a threat for God's existence, but there's actually good reasons to think that God would, or that a world that God created would contain evil and suffering. Meaning we shouldn't be surprised by the evil and suffering that we see in this world. We should expect it. God allows it. He permits it. Remember, this isn't to say God causes evil and suffering. No, I'm not saying that. Why would he allow or permit it? He allows or permits it because this is the best environment to achieve his superior purposes. And his purposes truly are superior. Character development, knowledge of God is much superior of an aim for free creatures, and we know this with our children, right, than just keeping them safe and comfortable. None of this is to say that God doesn't care about evil and suffering. God cares greatly about evil and suffering, and one day he promises, and he's going to end it for good. This is just to say that in the meantime, he allows free creatures like us, who are the cause and perpetrators of evil and suffering, to live, and he's using this evil and suffering in the world to develop us based on his superior purposes for our lives. And none of this is also to say that evil and suffering are not a problem. Evil and suffering are a great problem. Once again, God's going to deal with this problem. The whole point is just evil and suffering are in no way a problem or a threat for God's existence or his goodness.